when the empire embraced almost the entire northern part of Balkan Peninsula and a larger portion of what is now Austria, the Serbian nation was plunged into abject slavery after the fateful battle of 1389 at the Kosovo Polje against the overwhelming Asian hordes. Europe can never repay the great debt it owes to the Serbians for checking, by the sacrifice of its own liberty, that barbarian influx. With these words by the most famous Serb Nikola Tesla, good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to all of our presenters and our guests who are here today watching from all around the world. Good afternoon to our Serbs in Republika Srpska and the Republic of Serbia. My name is Zvezdana Stojanović, and I'm here in front of the Tesla's People, the chapter of the Tesla Science Foundation, the organization representing the Serbian diaspora. We thank the Commission members and Republika Srpska Ministry of Justice, Center for War Research, War Crimes and Missing Persons for having trust in us in supporting the conference today and helping with spreading the truth about this very important subject. The subject of our discussion today is the very beginning of the wars in ex-Yugoslavia, in Sarajevo, 1991 to 1995, and the suffering of the Serbs. Today is September 11th, and we all know what happened on this day in the United States in 2001. There's a direct connection to the events that happened there. In our world, in the Balkans, from 1991 to 1995, the whole Serbian Christian community in Sarajevo was destroyed by the same Islamic radical ideologies who attacked the United States. The suffering of the Serbs in history was immense. The Orthodox Christians, suffered persecution and their territories were devastated. Always on the crossroads of someone else's paths to conquer the foreign lands, Serbs have defended themselves and their territory. Us Serbs, friendly, hospitable people, we trust others. We're turned towards prosperity, peace, and we're proud of our heritage and our history. We have always lived peaceful with other people with different nationalities and religions. But in the past, this was used against us, and many have used our trust. 30 years ago, we found ourselves in the middle of the war. Our Serbian people have been wrongfully accused for all of these years for starting wars around ex-Yugoslavia, for killing the innocent, and even accused of genocide. The truth is somewhat different. We have been killed, expelled from our homes, forced to leave everything we have known. We have been bombed, and we've lost many lives of our dear ones. Lies have been told about us in the media all around the world. Our good name and our good reputation have been forever hurt. We are currently all around the world trying to piece our lives together and make sense of the past and tell our kids and our friends around the world about it. Before we begin, I would like to introduce a young Serbian woman who is a second generation in diaspora from Sarajevo. Julijana Pandurević will tell us her story.
Thank you, Zvezdana, for the introduction. Thank you, hvala vam, toda, spasibo, merci beaucoup, distinguished company and guests, and to the Honorable Commission for not only bestowing me the privilege to participate in this conference, but to be a witness to your highly important work. The first time I met my father's parents, my grandparents, Stana and Rajko Pandurević, I was 3 years old. I traveled to Sarajevo with my parents from Toronto. My uncle Dragan picked us up and drove us to Pale, which is a municipality of the city of Istočno, or in English, East Sarajevo. Along with my uncle, his wife and son, my grandparents were living in a makeshift refugee center, a former garage, with 3 other families. For decades prior, they had lived in the heart of Sarajevo, in the neighborhood of Grbavica, until the war, when they were forced out of their homes and ran for their lives along with the rest of the Serbs. The last time I ever saw my grandpa Rajko was in 2016, a year before he died. We went up the Trebević mountain in Sarajevo, where our family originates from, to see the mass Pandurević cemetery. There, we lay flowers at the grave of my uncle Miljan, who during the war was shot and killed by a sniper while driving in a car with his little boy, my cousin Marko, who was not even 5 years old at the time. The Pandurević family suffered, if not the highest, one of the highest family casualties in the region of Sarajevo during the war. My aunt, Sonja Pandurević, worked as a frontline first responder nurse while she recorded all Serbian casualties and missing soldiers. She says that over 200 Pandurević family members were killed. One of the first ever casualties of the war was our relative, Miki Pandurević, killed in the first barricade of March 1992. On June 8, 1992, Commander Petar Pandurević and his brigade was killed along with 14 of his comrades in a brutal attack by the Muslim forces against the Serbs on the Trebević front. My uncles, Ljubiša, Nedeljko, and Milomir were all wounded as well. The war left many holes in the Pandurević tapestry. In my first year of university, I went to register for the school's Human Rights Watch Commission. As I was spelling my last name to the representative, she asked me what my ethnicity was. And when I told her I was Serbian, she hesitated. And then she said, well, don't you find it awkward joining a Human Rights Watch if you're a Serb? How was the West hoodwinked into believing Serbs weren't the victims? Who made the call that my cousin Marko wasn't a victim when as a 5-year-old boy, he lost his father in front of his own eyes? Since when in war has suffering been one-sided? And since when in war is only one side of widows and orphans deserving of the world's sympathy? These are the questions I am hoping to discuss and answer today with you all. Former UN General Louis Mackenzie once said in an interview, if there were ever to be another war in the Balkans, the first thing the Serbs should do is hire American PR. We were the butchered when we were labeled as the butchers of the Balkans. And to that disgusting label, I reply, I am proud to be Serbian, to be one of a people who fight for our God of justice. I am even more proud to be a Serb from Sarajevo and to carry the last name Pandurević highly on the crown of my head. In the face of persecution for centuries, our people have persevered through faith and resilience. My younger brother, Nikola, has just started his first year at the University of Toronto, studying history and religion. His dream is to provide a voice for the Serbs in the teachings of history here in the West. I am currently in journalism school, working towards a career that will allow me to champion the Serbian narrative for its truth here in the media. I keep on my desk here an icon of Mother Mary and Jesus, given to me by my grandma Stana while they were living in the refugee center in Pale. It is my reminder of not only where I come from, but what I'm truly made of. It is our responsibility to carry our victims with us. We must honor them and fight to protect their legacies. In my heart are the names of my family, my Pandurevići, who gave their lives with the utmost of bravery to defend their home, their people, and their city. May this generation of Serbs and our allies be as loud as we can be to not only defend our victims, but our right to victimhood. Thank you all once again. With my closing, I'd like to quote Noam Chomsky, who once said, "The picture of the world that is presented to the public has only the remotest relation to reality. May we honor the past and build the future. Branimo istinu I ne damo srpsku." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julijana. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Suffering of the Serbs between 1991 and 1995 is a group of scholars who have done a significant amount of research, prepared documentation, and published it on a website for everyone's use. On their website, you can find 1,420-page report in 6 languages. The considerable amount of work involved in producing the information reflected in this report was accomplished in a short amount of time. An immense volume of materials was collected in order to accomplish the task. I will now welcome the chairman of the commission, Mr. Raphael Israeli, who was born in Morocco, currently teaching Islamic, Chinese, and Middle Eastern history and Hebrew at Hebrew University. He's a graduate of Hebrew University in history and Arabic literature PhD in Chinese and Islamic History of the University of California, Berkeley. Since 1974, he's a lecturer and then professor of Islamic and Chinese history at Hebrew University, with sabbatical periods spent at New York University in Toronto, the University of Pittsburgh, Harvard University, Boston University, Australian National University in Canberra, Melbourne University, and Naruto University in Japan. Fellow of the Jerusalem Center since 1970, author of over 50 research books and a dozen edited books, and some 100 scholarly articles and in the fields of Islamic radicalism, Islamic terrorism, and modern Middle East, Islam in China, Asia, and Europe. Mr. Israeli, please, we can start your presentation. Thank you.
Hey, good morning to, good afternoon to all. Of course, I am honored and pleased to say again, I don't know for how many times we have repeated this or several or similar messages regarding this question. You know, I was advised in March 2019 that I was appointed or elected as the chairman of this commission. They said president of the commission, but I objected to the term and I preferred to be chairman. And then I met all the members of the commission. There are 6 of us. And I immediately realized that although everybody called us the experts in this or that, that as a matter of fact, we were divided into 2 groups. One group of scholars, including myself, and one group of experts, real experts. And the difference being that the scholars only know that they can bring knowledge to the commission, while the experts also know what to do about it. And therefore, the 3 scholars of us really brought knowledge, their vast knowledge from their various fields, while the 2 experts, one a medical doctor, real doctor, and the other a psychologist, who not only knew their fields, but they also knew how to proceed in order to do something about it. And that is a huge difference between all of us. The purpose that was assigned to us was not to find out who is right or who is wrong in this war of Bosnia. Because, you know, it is said that war never determines who is right. War only determines who is left, but in another sense, because in war, many are killed. And perhaps those are the people who are right, because each of the parties fought for its own purpose. And those who are left, that is all of us that are left from the war, that survived the war, we were assigned with the task to make research about it and not to try to say who is right and who is left, but to try to find an objective truth that is independent of both of all those who fought during that war. And that's a very different kind of thing. And this is the reason why, when defining what was the aim or the purpose of this commission, when we had to decide what kind of information, what kind of research we wanted to explore and find out in order to come to some kind of objective truth that I said was not designed to give right to any of the parties, because we were an independent commission of inquiry. So we decided to divide between the 6 members of the commission specific domains of concern, of study, of scholarship that every one of us knew best. So first of all, we had to set up a general background, historical background, so that we understood the arena that is the Balkans, Bosnia, the relations between the 3 main components, Serbs, Croats, and Bosniak Muslims, who were the main actors in that field. And that background was marvelously supplied by my good friend Darko, who is a prominent historian and who gave us that important chapter. The next field was really the core issue of the conference, was to know Sarajevo, its background in history, and what actually happened in it between all the active forces during that war. And there was no better one to provide that general background than Viktor, who was present in that area during the entire length of the war, knew the local languages and so on, and therefore he could do this marvelous job. And his chapter, by the way, is going also to come out like the rest of our reports in civilian publication. The next area of importance was, of course, the media area, because, you know, in the war is known to the outside world by its coverage of the media. And we discovered, unfortunately, how the press can be very elusive and delusive by creating all kinds of situations that did not exist, and therefore our evaluation of that international press was, again, very, very ably provided for us by our late member who covered that press, Italian journalist. And then, of course, we had the people, the 2 experts that I named before, the doctor and the psychologist, who, the doctor, of course, is expert in disaster medicine, and we really had a disaster on our hands, including all those deaths, and the people who, right after the war and for a generation after that, continued to suffer from the post-traumatic situation. So he, together with Larry, our American psychologist and member of the commission, provided that psychological background that was so essential. And then finally, my modest contribution, which is shared by my assistant Anna, tried to explore the background of the Islamic history, not only in Bosnia, but in the Balkans in general, which constituted the major background for all that conflict and continues to our time to plague the entire problem of the Balkans, because Islam continuing to be aided from the outside is not about to find a solution immediately, but is continuing as it was before, because we have to bear in mind that what happened in Bosnia 20 or 30 years ago is a matter of fact not a new episode or a new unfolding of history, but as a matter of fact, a continuation 50 years later of what happened in World War II. Because if you will recall that history, you will remember that Croatia, together with Bosnia, formed that horrible pro-German state, which really committed very rampages against the Serbs, and many Serbs were exterminated as part of that terrible Croatic Bosnian state to annihilate the Serbian people, or to convert them into Catholicism, or to expel them. And they did all three of those. And therefore, if there is any talk of today of the genocide, that is the genocide, rather than the one case of Srebrenica, of which a big deal is done, and rightly so, because that is also an error, a horror, but that was not the only horror that was done, because the real one that was caused is then, not now. And the accusation, therefore, against the Serbs and so on is simply unfounded in history. And we have to call the attention of the world to that as an objective fact, which had nothing to do with that it had, I mean, everything to do with what's happening during the Bosnian War, because the Bosnian War, as I said, is simply a continuation of what happened during World War II, because if the Serbs reacted in Srebrenica and elsewhere with some horrific acts, is because they remembered what was done to them during World War II, and they wanted to avoid at any price a repetition of that horror. And when we discovered those facts and those connections by interrogating people and by digging deep into the sources, the documents, the meetings with people and their interviews, we realized the connections and the continuity between those two phases of history. And unless we take them as one continuity, we cannot understand neither the roots of the conflict nor its consequences. And therefore, unlike the claims of both sides that justice should be done to them, we realize how justice is relative, because every party thinks that his justice is the right one. Justice, just like beauty, is only in the mind of the observer, and everybody regards it from their point of view. You know, there is a famous story of a lawyer who represented his client in court, and after the verdict was pronounced, he sent a cable to his client saying, "Justice has won." He got a message back from his client saying, "Appeal immediately." That means that everybody does not regard the justice as something really absolute. And in order to find no justice, we cannot say that we found justice. As I said before, we cannot say who is right and who is wrong. But we wanted to find this absolutely independent reality or factual reality, completely detached from the claims or the accusations of each party separately. And unfortunately, as I said, we were not helped in that task by the media, who very often distorted and created false history that never appeared or never happened on the ground. Respectable newspapers like Le Monde in France or the Guardian in England created scenes of the ground in collaboration with the Croats or the Bosnians in certain grounds all over the arena of the fighting. And they were staged events, and they reported them as true events. Unfortunately, we could find out in many cases that they were manufactured and fake events, of which the Serbs were falsely accused. And therefore, facts or false facts like that, we were hoping to rectify. I am okay with the time, I don't know. Or I leave the rest to the questions if somebody wants to ask questions. Is that okay?
Does anybody have a question? You can send a question in the chat, or you can just raise your hand. And I think Mr. Israeli, you can continue a little bit longer.
Okay. Now, the major question that I think is the heart or the core of the entire conflict was, of course, the Islamic question, to which I can modestly perhaps contribute something, of course, with the help of Anna, my assistant. Because we have to take into consideration that during that terrible conflict, what we call the Bosnia War, there was a daily flight from Tehran to Sarajevo. And in those airplanes, the airplanes did not contain suites or nurses to help the sick. They were full of weapons and so-called Muslim volunteers who came to carry out their jihad, their holy war in Bosnia. Because their idea, under the guidance of Izetbegović at the time, and now his son is continuing that task, was to create in all Balkans, not only in Bosnia, a Muslim state that would ultimately coalesce with other radical Muslims all over the world in order to create the world caliphate. And indeed, many thousands of those so-called Islamic jihadists who volunteered for the war, volunteered, of course, for that purpose, not only did the war themselves, and so many of them were killed also in that war. But for them to be killed, it was not a sacrifice or a horrible thing they did. On the contrary, they were quite confident that by sacrificing themselves in battle, they went straight to paradise. So for them, it's not a sacrifice, but rather a very positive contribution to the glory of Islam worldwide. So they not only participated in the war, but they also contributed vastly, and we see the results now, to the strengthening of radical Islam, of the most radical types in the major cities of Bosnia, namely in Sarajevo itself and in other places, and following on the tradition of the many Islamic groups which had grown in Bosnia since the 20s and the 30s of the last century. Young people from Bosnia who had been sent to Egypt in order to study at the Azhar University. And when they came back to Bosnia, they indoctrinated young people like that and founded organizations like Al-Hidayah, for example, which is the Arabic word Al-Hidayah, that is the right guidance in order to change the minds, not only the heart, but also the minds of the Muslim population throughout Bosnia, and then to radiate it to the outside, to the areas in the Balkans which are already Islamic, like Albania and now Kosovo, and to the areas of the rest of the former Yugoslavian countries, like Sanjak in Serbia today, or Macedonia, where there is already a big contention for the power and the mind of the people in that tiny little state. So everybody now throughout the Balkans realizes that what happened in Albania first, and then in Kosovo, and now threatening the Sanjak, will continue to be threatened on the entire population in the Balkans and of Europe as a result of that, if they do not take the requisite measures in order to put an end to that trend. All right, I mean, we can continue, but my time is up, so decide.
Thank you so very much. Do we have a question for Mr. Israeli at this moment? Okay, we will actually focus then on the questions probably after the presentations of the rest of the commission. The next presenter is a member of the commission, Mr. Darko Tanasković. He was born in Zagreb, Croatia. He has master's degree in Faculty of Philology, Department of Oriental Studies. He retired as full professor at the same department. Professor Tanasković published over 800 papers and research work in various languages. Visiting professor at the University of Sarajevo, Skopje in Paris, at the University of Sofia, and the University in Rome. In 1995, he was nominated a member of the Academy of European Sciences and Arts in Salzburg. Darko Tanasković was teaching at the Faculty of Orthodox Theology in Belgrade, the Academy for Diplomacy and Security in Belgrade, at the Faculty of Political Sciences in Banja Luka. He was the president of the Council of the Diplomatic Academy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Serbia and the member of the Foreign Policy Council of the Minister of Foreign Affairs. In the 90s, he was accredited ambassador of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia to Turkey and Azerbaijan. In 2001, Darko Tanasković was appointed to the Yugoslav Commission for Truth and Reconciliation. He was ambassador for the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, Serbia to the Holy See and the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. In 2015 to 18, he served as an ambassador, permanent delegate of the Republic of Serbia to UNESCO. Mr. Tanasković, please start your.
Thank you. Do you hear me?
We can hear you.
You hear me? Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed for this presentation, unneeded presentation. Well, Mr. Chairman, dear members of the Commission, and esteemed guests and valuable organizers of this extraordinary conference, our chairman already mentioned the need to present the events in continuity, in historical and transhistorical continuity. And even this conference has a very nice title where the honor the past is one of the part of the title. So we had to honor the past as well within our commission and our work. And we decided at the beginning to tackle not only the synchronical dimension of events, but even the diachronical historical dimension of events, because they are so deeply rooted in history that at one side that could be explained by that, and the other side, the history has been used and misused in different ways during the war in Bosnia, all the Yugoslav crisis, as it has been done now. It was not easy to encompass all these centuries of Bosnian history in somehow 130 pages. But the purpose of this brief general historical introduction, as it has been pointed out by our chairman, was to highlight the salient events and processes from the past that have significantly contributed to the shaping of the structure of the society with which Bosnia and Herzegovina entered the 92 war. Given the function of the introduction, the focus was not on the completeness and comprehensiveness of the presentation. From that point of view, this presentation could be criticized, but the critics should take account of the fact that it was done just with theological purposes to serve the work of this commission and not to present all the history of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which would be impossible on 100 and 130 pages. The elements from the past, which were the most relevant to understanding the situation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, as I said, from 92 to 95, are highlighted in this introduction. The medieval history of Bosnia and Herzegovina until the Ottoman conquest was not specifically addressed, as it took place in the context of general developments of that time in Southeastern Christian Empire. However, the existence of heretical Bosnian church has had certain indirect repercussions in later periods of Bosnian and Herzegovinian history. Well, always we should say Bosnia and Herzegovina, but well, when I say Bosnia, I mean always Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is not neutral nowadays if you omit simply the Herzegovina to mention it, that some people do in Bosnia. And then there were some indirect repercussions in later periods of Bosnian history, especially in its interpretation, because there is a theory of direct continuity between nowadays Bosniaks and the so-called Bosnian heretical church, which couldn't be scientifically proved, but could be and is politically exploited. Therefore, in the treatment of the Ottoman occupation, the reference to the phenomenon of the Bosnian church was given a proper place. Well, then comes the Ottoman conquest and occupation that lasted for centuries, from mid-15th to the end, towards the end of 19th century, that caused a great historical upheaval and left lasting consequences on the entire social, economic, cultural, and spiritual being of Bosnia and Herzegovina. In addition to Orthodoxy and Catholicism, Islam entered the country as a religion, but also as a foreign system of values, organization of society, the foundation of legal norms, the basis of economic relations, and the cultural pattern. Since Bosnia and Herzegovina was a frontier province of the Ottoman Empire, on its territory, events throughout the centuries-long confrontation between Muslim East and Christian West became very intense in all stages. Within the Ottoman Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in accordance with the principled Islamic division of people into Muslims and non-Muslims, with certain local specifics, the Muslim population was privileged and non-Muslim Christian discriminated against. On this basis, distinct property inequality has been established within the system of special Ottoman feudalism, especially in the possession of arable land and real estate. The reflexes of this problem, this inequality, have long stretched throughout the post-Islamic era and partly determined the social or interreligious and inter-ethnic political and economic relations in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The most far-reaching consequence of the Ottoman occupation of the country was, without any doubt, the relatively mass Islamization of the local Slavic population, both urban and rural. And this is one specificity of the Islamization in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It was debated by experts and scholars why in Bosnia, the difference from some other countries in the Balkans, the rural population was Islamized as well, massively, and not only the urban population. Then it means that the new population corps was created, which made religious and ethnic and later national relations in Bosnia and Herzegovina even more complex. Therefore, in our introduction, particular attention has been paid to the process of Islamization in this historical overview. Compared to the centuries of Ottoman rule, the Austro-Hungarian occupation of Bosnia and Herzegovina lasted incomparably shorter, only 4 decades, but brought about major changes and left lasting consequences. Austro-Hungary, an extremely well-organized state with clear strategic goals, Drang nach Osten, and elaborated methods of operation in all fields, as well as a functionally organized administrative apparatus, that Austro-Hungary in Bosnia and Herzegovina systematically operated in all domains of political, social, and economic life. Well, what were the priorities of Vienna? The comprehensive Europeanization of the backward Ottoman province, its stronger attachment to the new metropolis, demographic engineering for the benefit of the Catholic population, the search for a formula for pacifying Muslims and alleviating their aversion to infidel authority, and thwarting national ambitions primarily of the Serbs in the context of hostility towards Serbia and Montenegro. Of special interest for our inquiry was the attempt to create an integral supra-ethnical and supra-confessional Bosnian nation, through which Austro-Hungarian governor Benjamin Kalaj had aimed to isolate Bosnia and Herzegovina from the influence of national ideas and movements radiating from Serbia, Montenegro, and Croatia. This creation of supra-ethnical and supra-confessional Bosnian nation failed, but the same idea was not separated forever, as we see now in our contemporary history, because I will say that afterwards, even during the communist time in Bosnia, and now after the disintegration of Yugoslavia in actual Bosnia, they always persisted the idea to create a Bosnian nationalism, the Bosnian nation, something that would not be Croats, Serbs, and Muslims, but something more. It failed in Yugoslavia. The Yugoslavs as nation have not been created, although there were better chances for that after the Second World War. But this idea of Kalaj's Bosnian nation survived, and there is a kind of attempt to apply it even now in nowadays Bosnia. After the defeat of Austro-Hungary in the bloody battles of the First World War and this disintegration, Bosnia and Herzegovina became part of the newly created kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, afterwards Yugoslavia. It was again a fundamental change for all residents. Serbs were now more favorably positioned than Muslims and Croats, and political struggles were taking place in and outside the parliament. The main confrontation was between the centralist aspiration of King Alexander Karađorđević and the federalist or separatist demands of the Croats. Well, Muslims, they're basically closer to the Croats, were tacticizing and joining alliances and coalitions seeking to protect their interests in the best way. In the backward of their political activities, there was always a vision of a territorial integrity and the autonomy of Bosnia and Herzegovina that couldn't be achieved. Then came the Second World War, already mentioned by our president. That war began with the occupation of Yugoslavia, whose territory was divided between Germany, Italy, and their Balkan allies. Bosnia and Herzegovina was a part of the quisling, extremely nationalist and criminal independent state of Croatia, with one part controlled by Germany and the other by Italy. Throughout the war, genocidal state project of annihilation of Serbs, Jews, and Roma, as our chairman already mentioned, was implemented throughout the so-called independent state of Croatia, including Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Muslims were largely involved. I'll insist here, not all the Muslims and all the Muslim population, but generally they were inclined to support all the measures that were anti-Serbian. At the same time, in the civil war between the Serbian monarchists, so-called Chetniks, and Tito's communist movement partisans, there were multiple waves of retaliation for the crimes committed against the civilian population, with many casualties on both the Serb and the Muslim sides. The heaviest battles of the World War II on the Yugoslav territory were fought in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Long before the end of the fighting, the victorious Communist Party, or the Communist forces in 1943, the constitutional foundations of the post-war Federal Republic of Yugoslavia's land, and within it, the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina as a continuity of equal community of equal nationalities, Serbs, Croats, and Muslims. It was the only republic without national designation. There was not a nation that was prevalent in that time in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The period from the end of the World War II to the disintegration of the Yugoslav Federation can be roughly divided in two periods. The first lasted from the end of the war to the mid-60s and was marked by spirit of the brotherhood and so-called brotherhood and unity polity of the Yugoslav people. Subsequently, the process of awakening Republican nationalisms, conflicts over political and economic development, and accelerating disintegrated tendencies gradually strengthened. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, given that there was no single majoritarian nation, the Republican leadership sought to maintain a model of supranational unity that I already mentioned before, with the greatest reliance of Muslims, because as they didn't have and don't have their motherland, Serbia or Croatia, they were always inclined to participate in projects that should create supranational states with them as the prospectively majoritarian nation. In the meantime, it was decided to officially adopt their religious name Muslim as a national name Muslim. So the Muslims became the Muslims nationally, which was always very difficult to explain anybody in the world. And I remember as Orientalist and participating in different congresses and seminaries, our foreign colleagues always asked us how the same designation Muslim could mean at the same time religious group and the nation. Then that was one of Yugoslav's specificities, but finally it turned out to be perhaps at that time understandable, but a wrong decision, because everything has become unclear in that nation religious term. Muslim national emancipation was accompanied by social affirmation of Islam and its values, followed by Islamist politicization. They were explaining that it was only cultural emancipation of Muslims, but as you know, in Islam, there is nothing in culture separated from politics, there is nothing in economy separated from politics, and it was just a device to make Islam socially, ambientally more important than before through cultural channels of social promotion. Some people were at that time aware of this danger. Immediately before the final breakup of Yugoslavia with the introduction of a multi-party system, national parties of Muslims, Serbs, and Croats were created. There, they overwhelmingly won the first free elections in 1990, and after a short period of coalition cooperation, entered into a fierce conflict due to different views on the future of Yugoslavia. Representatives of Muslims and Croats, despite opposition from Serbian delegates, meaning Serbs, adopted Bay and each Bosnia and Herzegovina a memorandum of independence in the parliament, and shortly thereafter, in the same manner, decided to hold a referendum on independence. The Serb boycotted this controversial referendum and the declaration of independence, and soon the international recognition of Bosnia and Herzegovina were the political reasons for war, casus belli, And so the civil war broke out in April 92. At the end of this short presentation, I would just like to emphasize 2 or 3 points. First of all, in this overview, we see that the Islamization of Bosnia and Herzegovina was a very important event in its history with lasting consequences. Then the idea of creation of a Bosnian nation was as well something that came from the past and has been revived. At least they tried to revival of it in the modern period. Third, and I think that it is very important, if anything is important, conclusion of our commission is that in this historical overview, we discussed more than it was until now. It has been until now, in general in historical works, the period from Second World War to the disintegration of Yugoslavia. Because from the reasons, we can't enter now in explanation of all these reasons, they are ideological and others. Some people always treated that the breakup of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Yugoslavia and subsequently the war just came like that, as if nothing was happening in the communist period of development of Bosnia and Herzegovina. We insisted in this historical overview that during the communist time were led the basis for what came afterwards. It is the creation of the Republican nationalism and the supranational and supraethnical Bosnia, difference of other Yugoslav republics. Then the communists, generally speaking, they were not, so to say, neutral, and the government in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Republican government made up by from Serbs, Muslims, and Croats were working together on this project. And at the end, I would emphasize that the conclusion of the commission unanimously shared that we shouldn't try to find the reasons for the war in some military action and who was the first to enter the territory to kill somebody or to make the first acts of war is not important to understand the reasons of the war. The reasons of the war are the political decisions of Muslims and Croats that decided to go to referendum in a deeply divided country. It's one thing if you have the referendum in Switzerland or in France, and the other thing to have in Bosnia and Herzegovina, deeply divided religiously and politically, and then to completely marginalize Serbs in political decisions. So Serbs were practically thrown out of the parliament with the decision to go for the independent Bosnia. And then this was practically the political or polemogenic decision that practically decided about the future of Bosnia and the tragedy that subsequently came. About that tragedy, here, with more competence, will speak my dear colleague, Viktor Bezrucenko. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. I ask everyone if you have a question for Mr. Tanasković to raise your hand. We'll leave those questions for the end. The Vice Chairman of the Commission, Mr. Viktor Bezrucenko, he was born in Moscow, Russia. He obtained his bachelor's degree in Military Institute of Moscow, and he was commissioned as second lieutenant in 1980. He was a military observer with the United Nations in the Middle East, and between 1993 and 1994, he was a chief of staff on Perforce Sector Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In 1994, he retired from the army of the rank of colonel. Between 1994 and 2002, He held the post of civil affairs officer with United Nations mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and worked in Gornji Vakov, Sarajevo, and Brčko, being the longest serving UN officer of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Between 2002 and 2019, he served as a military analyst with the United Nations International Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, and as United Nations Security Officer in Iraq, Sudan, New York, and Afghanistan. Viktor Bezrucenko also holds a master's degree in political science from Sarajevo University and a PhD in political science from the University of Kiev, Ukraine. He is the author of about 20 publications on international law and military history. He speaks Russian, English, French, Serbian, Croatian, Polish, and Ukrainian. Mr. Bezrucenko, you can start your presentation.
Zvezdana, thank you so much. My presentation is quite expansive since it broaches on a number of interrelated subjects, but I will do my best not to burden you with unnecessary details and perhaps limit myself to the allotted 20 minutes. I would like to start my presentation with a conceptual issue of the character of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In fact, this issue is still being debated by the international academic community, and to this date, this debate has generated two mutually irreconcilable views. One is that the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina was a war of aggression waged by SRJ, that is Zvezdana Republika Yugoslavia, that is by Serbia and Montenegro, against the internationally recognized and democratic Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The second view is that the war was a civil war among the three nations of the country, and these nations had mutually exclusive political agendas. Bosniak historians and politicians, especially those in the Federation of the Bosnia and Herzegovina, regard this war mostly as a war of aggression on the part of Serbia. They believe that the internationally recognized Bosnia and Herzegovina became a victim of Serbian aggression. The other group of authors profess the view that the war was a civil war. The Commission has made a point of addressing this issue at the very start of its work to understand the character of the war, because in fact this character and this issue determined all subsequent events in the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina. This issue was analyzed on the basis of criteria accepted and promulgated by the International Red Cross and the Red Crescent, and is based on the practice of international tribunals, which have made significant contribution into the research of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I am not going to dwell in detail on those criteria, but I will just enumerate them for you to understand how complex this issue really is. So there are 7 criteria altogether which differentiate a conflict between an internal conflict, that is a civil war, and an international conflict, that is a war between 2 states. The first criteria is that the war is waged in the territory and within the borders of an internationally recognized state, which has a sufficiently large population. The warring parties involved in the armed violence and must have a minimum level of military organization. The warring parties have their organized armed forces. The state directly participates in the war through the engagement of the army and police. And if the state authority does not function or collapses, as was the case in Bosnia, then the group which represents the state at an international level claims that the state authority is a warring party. All warring parties utilize their internal domestic human resources, and all warring parties conduct hostilities in form of offensive and defensive operations in accordance with their military manuals and concepts. The analysis of the above-mentioned criteria leads us to believe that the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina between 92 and 95 undoubtedly was a civil war. This opinion coincides with the verdicts of the ICJ, International Court of Justice, and ICTY, International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. Let me remind you that in 1993, Bosnia and Herzegovina sued Serbia for alleged genocide in the United Nations International Court of Justice. The case was prepared by loyal expert Francis Boyle, Dr. Francis Boyle, an advisor, legal advisor to Alija Izetbegović. He filed the claim. The International Court of Justice dealt with this issue over a period of 14 years. And finally, in January 2007, the court pronounced its verdict. By 13 votes to 2, the court determined that Serbia had not committed a genocide, though its organs and persons whose acts engage in responsibility under international, under customary international law, in violations or obligations under the Convention of the Prevention of Genocide. The court decided that Serbia had not conspired to commit genocide, nor incited the commission of genocide. This verdict has dispelled the popular Bosniak myth about the aggression and genocide committed by Serbia against Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is, I think, an important point that the Commission has made. Now, speaking a little bit about the events which preceded the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, I'd like to emphasize the event which took place on 10 June 1991, when the SDA held a congress in Sarajevo, which made a decision to create the paramilitary groups of Bosnian Muslims. This Congress also established the Council for National Protection of Muslim Nation, which called on all the Muslims to arm themselves and commence preparations for war. This is a very important point, because what we have to bear in mind is that this event took place in mid-1991, when the only legal military formations in the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina were the GNA and the Territorial Defense. Therefore, the Patriotic League and the Green Berets, which were created by the Council, were in fact illegal paramilitary organizations and operated in secrecy. It is also important to bear in mind that this event, that is creation of Patriotic League in mid-1991, was a major event which initiated the legal dismantling of constitutional order of Bosnia and Herzegovina. This council was an illegal institution, so was the Patriotic League. And the Serbs of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and for that matter, Croats as well, responded by creating their own military units and started organizing themselves territorially into Serbian and Croat autonomous regions. Another important point which the Commission has arrived to is it has established the national breakdown of the Army of Bosnia and Herzegovina. 99.6% of the personnel of the army constituted the share of Bosnian Muslims. Croats had the share of only 1.4%, and Serbs had the share of 0.7%. That is, the army of Bosnia and Herzegovina was a solid Muslim monolith with only token representation of Serbs and Croats, which played absolutely no role, neither in the decision-making or on any operations on the ground. By definition, this army could only protect the interests of the Muslim population and Muslim nation, but certainly not the interests of Serbs and Croats, which was claimed by the government of Alija Izetbegović. A few words about the siege of Sarajevo. The blockade of Sarajevo, I am deliberately eschewing the term siege, was the key and the most publicized event in the War of Bosnia in 1992-1995. The dominant narrative dominating the war in Bosnia is that the Serbs were holding Sarajevo under siege and were mercilessly shelling the city with their artillery. However, the reality is more complex and more nuanced and deserves more analysis and more historical comparisons. In early April, on the 5th and 6th April 1992, following the international recognition of Bosnia and Herzegovina, violence erupted in Sarajevo, where a fluid urban battle between Muslim and Serb TO forces resulted in confrontation line, which determined the configuration of the front line and the de facto division of the city. Serb units and Serb population defended the residential areas with substantial Serb population, such as Hadžić, Ilijaš, Vagošća, Pale, part of Stari Grad, part of Nova Sarajevo, and the biggest part of Ilidža, which were claimed by Republika Srpska and became controlled by VRS, that is Vojsko Republike Srpske. Therefore, any discussions of the siege of the entire Sarajevo by Serb forces are irrelevant. At best, any expert or any outside observer can speak about the siege, if he wishes to use this term, of the core municipalities of urban Sarajevo. Another important issue which I would like to dwell on is that siege militarily is understood as a method of warfare characterized by an encirclement of a locality or an area, leading to an isolation and followed by attacks to crush the resistance. The use of a siege is not prohibited in international law, provided it is directed solely against a military objective and in conformity with all relevant international humanitarian rules. In this sense, the starvation of civilians as method of combat, as well as subjecting civilian population to suffering and undue hardship through lack of supplies, are essential. Working on my portion of the report, I have examined numerous documents of the VRS Sarajevo Romania Corps and the VRS main staff. Never in these documents I came across the term siege. Professional military officers of the Vojska Republike Srpske always use the professional term blockade, which makes a huge difference as compared to the term siege. Historically, under siege, starvation has been the main weapon of a blocking force. This was the case during the American Civil War, and this was the case in the Second World War of the siege of Leningrad and the siege of Sebastopol in the Soviet Union. I would like to provide a quote of the United Nations Commission of Experts report, which specifically noted the issue of starvation of the population of Sarajevo. Let me read it out. The tendency of both sides to control food, water, and electricity for population, and the intermingling of military forces and the civilian population, and the fact that no one appears to have died during the siege from starvation, dehydration, or freezing, combine to make it difficult the establishment of a solid case that starvation is being used as a method of warfare. The conduct of this matter has been deplorable, but its criminality is debatable. As historically, starvation has indeed been the main weapon of siege, and as there was no starvation, according to the United Nations, in Sarajevo, this means logically that there was no siege but blockade. The difference perhaps may be eluding, but it is very important because it is about the criminality of the fact of the operations in the area of Sarajevo. In this sense, the blockade of Sarajevo cannot stand any comparison to the blockade of Leningrad and the Sebastopol between 1941 and 42. The population of Sebastopol and Leningrad did not receive any humanitarian aid. The population of Sarajevo did receive humanitarian aid. If you will give me just 1 second, I will find the exact figures, and they will illustrate this premise of mine. Just 1 second, please. Yes. You are probably aware of the fact that on 29 June 1992, the VRS handed over Sarajevo Butmir Airport to the United Nations for delivery of humanitarian aid to Sarajevo. Between June 1992 and January 1996, almost 13,000 transport flights, cargo flights, were made under the sponsorship of the United Nations to Sarajevo and delivered almost 161,000 tons of humanitarian assistance. The humanitarian assistance was delivered for the civilian population, at least in theory. But in reality, almost 20% was sent to the army of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Sarajevo was never isolated from the outside world completely. Between 92 and 95, numerous international organizations and delegations visited Sarajevo. All of them arrived through airport. These delegations included 11 presidents, 8 prime ministers, 31 ministers, and 29 ambassadors, as well as 11 highly placed functionaries of the United Nations, including the Secretary General. Now, a few words about the myth of the so-called Serb military superiority in the area of Sarajevo. A good study of Sarajevo operations is contained in the CIA study Balkan Battlegrounds. According to this study, the manpower of the Sarajevo-Romania Corps numbered about 18,000 men. According to numerous Serbian sources, including the operational documents, the Corps manpower between 92 and 90, by April 92, in fact, did not exceed 13,000 men and increased to 18,000 by the end of the war. However, its annual average manpower never exceeded 13,000. The United Nations Commission of Experts' final report on the siege of Sarajevo estimated artillery holdings of various Sarajevo-Romania Corps to be between 600 and 1,100 pieces of field artillery and mortars. This assessment is, or at least seems to be, grossly exaggerated. The CIA study, which I have already mentioned, assessed the Corps firepower holdings between 60 and 70 artillery pieces, 120 mortars, and up to 80 tanks. Most of them were inserviceable. On the other hand, the first Sarajevo Corps of the Army of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was raised in the end of 1992, had the manpower up to 60,000 men. Again, the United Nations Commission of Experts' final report does not mention any RBH artillery assets and holdings at all, creating an impression that the Muslim units in Sarajevo simply did not have any artillery. This is not the case. By the end of the war, artillery holdings of the First Corps consisted of about 40 pieces of artillery, about 100 anti-aircraft guns, which were used for direct fire, as well as up to 150 mortars. This is according to the Serb military sources. Therefore, when we are talking about the artillery barrages around the area of Sarajevo, we have to bear in mind that this was not a one-sided phenomenon, but this was an ongoing battle in which both sides used all their available assets, meaning artillery and snipers as well. A few words about targeting. The Commission has recorded numerous cases of treacherous behavior of the RBH forces, which placed their fire assets near key infrastructure and residential areas, which opened fire, provoking Serbs to return fire. In fact, Sarajevo was literally saturated with military targets. In downtown Sarajevo, were accommodated the corps level headquarters, brigade headquarters, military installations, various firing positions, depots, storages, and barracks. Numerous military factories and production shops were also located in urban areas. Overall, at the height of the war, there were between 1,800 and 2,000 various sized military targets in the urban part of Sarajevo. Therefore, whenever military operations were going around the city, all these targets were covered by artillery fire from Serbian side, which definitely produced side effects and collateral damage. I would also like to say that in most cases, the fighting around Sarajevo was initiated by the Bosnian Muslim forces. This is also confirmed by observations of numerous United Nations officers, including several commanders like General Rose and General Mackenzie. Just to name a few of such operations. June 6, 1992, offensive operation Summer 92. June 8, 1992, Operation Zmai 92. 31 July 1992, Operation Polinia. End of August, Operation South 92. September, Operation Koverat, envelope. Next year, 1993, 30th of May, RBH undertook Operation Priboj 93 with the objective to cut the Lukovica-Pale road, which failed. In fact, all of these operations failed, and by the end of 1992, the losses of the First Sarajevo Corps amounted to 3,000 men killed, which was a very significant number by the standard of this war. There is also statistics which suggests that whenever the BIH forces did not launch any operations around Sarajevo, the situation of the city was relatively calm, and the number of casualties in the city decreased significantly. The core issue of this report is the issue of the campaign of terror against the Serbian population unleashed and conducted by SDA. Perhaps I should start talking on this particular point by saying that the Serbian community had existed in Sarajevo for centuries and had a long history. Many entrepreneurs, doctors, economists, teachers, and professors of Serbian and Montenegrin origin lived and worked in Sarajevo. Among them were historian Milutinović Saralija, publicist and founder of the literary magazine Bosanska Vila Nikola Kašiković, historian Jefto Dedijer, historian Vladimir Čorović, writer Masha Selimović, and others. In fact, according to the last peacetime census of population, the share of Muslims in the city was about 50%. The Serbs accounted for 30%, but with Yugoslav almost slightly more, in fact, than 40%. In absolute numbers, that made 200,000 people. It is important to note that Sarajevo, after Belgrade, was the largest city in Yugoslavia with the Serbian population before the war. The SDA strategy was designed to expel the Serb community from Sarajevo. Through its action and inaction, the SDA contributed to the crimes against the peaceful Serbian population of Sarajevo committed by both numerous criminal groups and regular units of the Army of Bosnia and Herzegovina. These crimes included arbitrary arrests, imprisonment and concentration camps, torture, rape, and murder. Combined with systematic anti-Serbian propaganda, these crimes constituted a systematic campaign of pressure and translated into decades of ethnic cleansing, culminating in the exodus of Serbs from Sarajevo following the Dayton Peace Accords. As part of the SDA campaign, Serbs were purposefully and systematically removed from leadership positions. A year after the beginning of the war, there was not a single Serb left in a position of a director of a company, head of a clinic, dean of a faculty, head of a municipal service, etc. With the beginning of the war, Serbs became the target of chauvinism and terror. According to the memoirs of Yugoslav Olympic champion Manuela Čalija, the Serbs were ethnic hostages who were under ethnic oppression, and their lives depended on alias butchers and their goodwill. In the early days of the war, a special unit of the Ministry of Interior, headed by Zoran Cegar, arrested some 800 Serbs on the orders of the SDA and took them to Koševa Stadium, which was turned into an improvised concentration camp. According to Mirko Pijanović, a former member of the Presidium of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, this incident clearly demonstrated the revanchism of the Izetbegović's regime and the persecution of ordinary people. There is a clear parallel between the concentration camp at the Koševa Stadium and the Nazi concentration camps in the independent state of Croatia. Serbian Democratic Party was banned and declared totalitarian and terrorist. All Serbs were put on the list of suspected members of the Serb Democratic Party. Kidnappings of Serbs became a common practice. They were taken for interrogation to local prisons from where they often did not return. Many of them were ill-treated and beaten. There were hundreds of such cases. We have found that there were up to 70 private prisons in Sarajevo where Serbs were kept for ransom. Just to give you a few examples. History professor and academician Milorad Ekmečić was brutally beaten in front of his family and his house was looted. The professor was taken away without a warrant for arrest and held in a private prison, where he was maltreated and badly beaten. Medical professor Milutin Najdanović was the SDS delegate at Skupština and was shot point blank by unknown assailants in broad daylight. Popular Serbian musician and composer Slobodan Samardžić was killed in May 1992. Entire Serb families were killed or vanished. 6 members of Serbian Ristović family, including 3 children, were killed during lunch at home on 8 July 1992. The Muslim paramilitaries and subsequently the regular units of the Army of Bosnia and Herzegovina participated and were implicated in all those crimes. Izetbegović appointed criminals with pre-war record of criminality as brigade commanders in Sarajevo. Mušan Topalović Tsatsou became the commander of the 10th Mountain Brigade, which controlled the municipality of Stari Grad, and Juka Prazina, a criminal, was controlling municipality of Novi Grad, and Ramis Delalić, Cello, by nickname, received under his command the 10th Mountain Brigade, which controlled the Opština of Center. Their soldiers committed murders, robberies, extortion, rape, and so-called requisitions and confiscations of property. Many of these killings were committed of ethnic hatred, but also out of criminal motives of looting valuables and seizure of apartments of Serbian victims. Facing the mounting international criticism, as well as numerous appeals to rein in the criminals in Sarajevo, Izetbegović finally decided to authorize Operation Trebević II on 26 October 1993. The aim of the operation was to arrest Tsatso and Cheva and disband the 9th and 10th brigades. Tsatso tortured and killed several police officers who were sent to arrest him. After his arrest, Tsatso was immediately killed, obviously on the orders of Izetbegović, who did not want this dangerous witness to remain alive. I would like to refer you to a wonderful research made by Mr. Chandler, a former operative of United States Security Agency, who has written a very good book, Unholy Terror. He deeply analyzed the developments of Sarajevo during the war, as well as the criminal role of the SDA in what had happened to the Serb community. He stated, and I fully support this view, that culpability of Izetbegović's regime is no longer in question. President Izetbegović was certainly aware of what was going on in the city. He received reports from his military intelligence and counterintelligence on the daily basis, and he had been tolerating this reign of terror for almost 2 years before he was actually forced to take action. The crimes committed by the army of Bosnia and Herzegovina in Sarajevo reveal the criminal hypocrisy of Izetbegović's regime. While he preached multiculturalism and common life of Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs in a single state, in public forums and internationally, the institutions that he controlled incited ethnic hatred, and the army in which he was, and the army of which he was the supreme commander, committed war crimes and crimes against humanity against his own citizens only because they were Serbs. According to Professor Mirko Pijanović, who had written a number of interesting books about Sarajevo, this was the dark side of the army and the state, and this was something that undermined the state from within. The number of victims, of Serb victims, which fell victim to the SDA crimes is still undetermined. According to Mirko Pijanović, the number of Serb victims in Sarajevo during the war was up to 3,000 people, including both killed and missing. Former police officer Sima Tuševlak, speaking as a witness at the International Tribunal of Former Yugoslavia, stated that more than 3,000 Serbian citizens were killed during the war in Sarajevo. According to his testimony, in Grbavica alone, because of shelling and sniping by the army of Bosnia and Herzegovina, up to 1,000 people might have died, including various soldiers. In fact, this figure is even higher than that. It is about 6,000 men and women. Now, researching the database of the Republika Srpska Center for War Research, War Crimes and Missing Persons, the Commission found out that 2,770,000 citizens were killed in pre-war Sarajevo. This database also includes the names of 174 persons missing in Sarajevo during the war. These numbers seem credible, given the fact that RBH in Sarajevo burned and destroyed 56 Serb settlements and villages. And after the war, 28 Serbian mass graves were identified. I believe that the exodus of Serb population from Sarajevo had been going on for many years and instituted a continuous campaign of ethnic cleansing. Sarajevo Serbs massively left the territory under the control of Army of Bosnia and Herzegovina and HVO and moved into Republika Srpska or to Serbia. Following the Dayton Peace Accords, several of the optionals of the former Serb Sarajevo, which had been renamed East Sarajevo, such as Vagoša, Iljaš, Hadžići, and Ilidža, were reintegrated into the Federation in February and March 1995. I witnessed this process. It is extremely difficult to describe it without emotions. People were leaving their homes in which they had been living for centuries. Many of them were forced to abandon all their property. And many of them exhumated and unearthed the remains of their dear ones and took them to the cemeteries in other locations in the Republika Srpska. This was the case of my interpreter, Sanja, who exhumed the body of her brother who was killed in battle. And she buried him again in military cemetery in Sokolac. According to the United Nations data, during this period, between 50 and 65 Serbs left the territory of Sarajevo, which closed, in fact, the chapter of existence of Serb community in this city. As a result of crimes, massive ethnic cleansing, and deliberate campaign of terror and intimidation, the active pre-war Serb community in Sarajevo virtually ceased to exist. This brings to end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Any questions from all of our guests? Okay, we will continue afterwards. The next speaker will be Patrick Barriot. MD is a specialist in anesthesiology, intensive care, and disaster medicine. He has participated in and completed the international training course of the United Nations Disaster Assessment and Coordination Team. He had a career in the French Army where he was successfully assigned to the multiple positions, including the war in former Yugoslavia. He left the Army with the rank of colonel. He was afterward a hospital practitioner of civilian hospitals with a specialty of surgical intensive care. He participated in numerous relief and humanitarian aid operations during armed conflicts, wars in former Yugoslavia, in Iraqi Kurdistan and Congo, and natural disasters, earthquake epidemics. In July 1990, during the popular uprising in Tirana, Albania, he was the only doctor in the foreign embassies, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, Turkey, to provide medical care for the thousands of Albanians who have taken refuge in the precincts of the embassies. He's the author of many medical and scientific publications in the major international journals and emergency medicine books. He's currently medical doctor of the European Institute of Health Training, Director of Medical Operations of the Rapid Consortium, charged with ensuring the safety of expatriates in very high-risk areas like Mogadishu and Somalia, a lecturer at the Faculty of Medicine, France, and the University of Health Sciences in Casablanca, Morocco.
Thanks so much. Good day, everyone. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, I would like to say I am very moved by Juliana's words and the story of Pandurević family. I am speaking today as the French representative for the Commission and as a medical doctor. I'm going to talk to you now about the lasting effects of the war on the Serbian nation and their psyche, as well as the impact of post-traumatic stress disorder on the population. On this somber anniversary of the horrific 9/11 terror attacks, I'd also like to draw attention to the ongoing terrorist threat from Islamic extremists in the Balkans. First of all, I would like to address, as Viktor did, the completely misunderstood strategic aspect of the conflict in Sarajevo. The term siege, which was and still is widely employed in the media for this combat, is completely inappropriate for what really happened at the time. The Serbs in Sarajevo, in fact, suffered a double blockade. The first one corresponded to the front line of the conflict and closed off all the city and its inhabitants. The second blockade, however, targeted exclusively Serbian citizens living in the Muslim part of Sarajevo. In this part of the city, Serbs were subjected to a sinister campaign of demonization and an abominable campaign of terror, both of which were organized by Alija Izetbegović's SDA. Serbs were relegated to the status of outlaws and often brutally attacked, especially within the multitude of prisons run by the SDA and their political partners. One of the specific aspects of this campaign of terror was indeed the creation of a vast network of prisons in which the very worst atrocities were committed. 211 private prisons have been identified to date and precisely located. You heard me right, 211 private prisons. From 1992 to 1995, the lives of Serbs in Sarajevo were worthless. Serbs' lives didn't matter at all. Serbs' lives didn't matter at all. It must therefore be stressed that the majority of the killings and maiming of Serbs in Sarajevo was not a direct consequence of fighting between two armies, but caused by criminal political acts against civilians. Serbian families suffered untold physical and psychological trauma caused by experiencing and witnessing murder, torture, and rape. These ordeals were responsible for the development of significant after effects, such as post-traumatic stress disorder. In order to manipulate public opinion, the real political and historical context of this war was completely disregarded and the deep root cause of the conflict ignored. You could say that only cookie cutter analysis was employed to explain the events. History is nevertheless a continuum, and we must seek out the root causes of the conflict in the preceding decades to gain a real understanding. It is true that the casus belli of this war was the referendum of May 1992. Although I ask you, can we brush aside the significance of the genocide perpetrated by the independent Croatian state against the Serbs and Jews during the Second World War? And how can we ignore the fact that Bosnian Muslims supported the Ustasha of Ante Pavelić at that time? Our chairman, Professor Raphael Israeli, emphasized this crucial point. In light of these harrowing historical events, we can easily understand the reaction of the Serbs when they saw their historical enemies coalescing once again to threaten their biological survival and their culture. In both these 20th century conflicts, the same aggressors collaborated against the Serbian people. We are more familiar today with the terrible trauma that not only the Serbian families suffered during the Second World War itself, but also the painful legacy which was passed on to their descendants. Our Commission's very own scientific study has also revealed that on top of this family transmission of war trauma, incredibly, a transgenerational transmission also exists. In other words, today's Serbian population are still suffering from the trauma of these two 20th century conflicts, which so impacted their ancestors. The ordeal of the Serbs in Sarajevo in between 1992 to 1995, therefore, had revived the collective suffering inherited from the Second World War, which had been passed on by their own parents and grandparents. And Juliana told us very much about this transmission. The campaign of terror organized by the FDA was all too reminiscent of the acts carried out by the independent state of Croatia. So how then can we be surprised that the Serbs felt their survival was being openly threatened? If the independence referendum of May 1992 was the trigger, the Dayton Accords of December 1995 were obviously the direct cause of the great exodus of Serbs from Sarajevo. This terrible agreement simply sacrificed Serbs, so they had no other choice than the suitcase or the coffin. In fact, they ended up living with both their suitcases and the coffins of their loved ones. To ensure the protection of their families and their dead, they had to give up their land, their homes, and their possessions. During this war, NGOs and media showed they're completely biased in favor of just one party involved in the conflict, taking up the cause of the Muslim secessionists. To achieve their goal and support Bosniak independence, they weaponized the suffering of civilian populations. Human suffering therefore became a means of forwarding political objectives and interest. NGO and media achieved their ambition through a double process of victimization and demonization. These two processes were a bit like two sides of the same coin. On the first side, the victimization of one party of the conflict allowed a specific community to present itself as the main and only victim. This would then encourage interventionist Western powers to get involved in the name of the right of humanitarian intervention. These bodies unscrupulously exaggerated the suffering of Bosniak Muslims while remaining totally silent about the suffering of Serbs. Bosniak have even been compared to the Jews of the Second World War. The use of World War II rhetoric has led to outrageous analogies, inappropriate comparison, and indecent amalgams. Not only has the suffering of the victims of war in the former Yugoslavia been manipulated, but also the memory of the victims of the Holocaust. So that That was one side of the coin. What about the other, I hear you ask? Well, the other side of the coin was the total demonization of the Serbian people. The victimization of Bosnian Muslims has resulted in the demonization not only of the Serbian leadership, but also of the Serbian people as a whole. This vilification and dehumanization of Serbs obviously generated incredible hatred against them. This would then deprive them of any form of compassion whatsoever and justify all coercive measures made against them. In the end, one community as a whole was seen as the only real victim of the conflict, while the other community was considered to be entirely criminal. Therefore, the Serbian population of a city that claims to be tolerant and multi-ethnic has been totally eradicated by those who still claim to be the main victims of this conflict. Even today, more than 25 years after the war ended, newspapers still publish without question, the Bosniak propaganda of the 1990s. The power and influence of this insidious disinformation under the guise of entertainment should not be underestimated either. The Western fiction and entertainment industry has fully adopted Bosniak propaganda in all its productions, including television serials, fictional movies, novels, and songs. A quarter of a century after the war, public opinion is still molded by this Hollywood representation of the war in Sarajevo. So those are the key issues from a psychological perspective. You may wonder then, what are the solutions? There are many solutions that could be considered. I will focus on just 4 of them today. The first most obvious solution is simply to take concrete action to care for and protect the Serbian people suffering from trauma and the after effects of the war. This can concern people with not just physical, but psychological symptoms, and should not just be limited to medical and psychiatric care, but also social care. The second kind of measure needs to have the aim of locating the many missing Serbs. About 3,000 Serbian civilians were killed in Sarajevo between 1991 and 1995, with 1,665 seriously injured. As of today, some 800 Serbs have been reported missing from the part of Sarajevo controlled by the SDA. But the number of missing Serbs is probably much, much higher. To this date, about 260 Serbs have still not been found. Their families are still waiting for the competent institutions in this part of the city to take the necessary steps to find their loved ones. All their appeals so far have fallen on deaf ears. All their appeals so far have fallen on deaf ears. Unfortunately, many problems and obstacles have built up in the search for the missing Serbs in that part of Sarajevo, which is now part of the Sarajevo canton in the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Bosniak SDA officials, for a start, have shown complete reluctance to help these Serbian families. They have indeed made immense effort to cover up the crimes committed against Serbian citizens, using all means possible to prevent the excavations from being completed. The missing Serbs must not be abandoned, and the search must resume. The first measure that needs to be implemented as a matter of urgency is to redress the complete denial of justice for Serbs. Violence against Serbs has never been qualified for what it really was. That is nothing less than war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocidal acts. The perpetrators of these atrocious crimes against Serbs have incredibly benefited from exceptional leniency from judges and staggeringly often received complete impunity. Both international, ICTY, and Bosniak courts have contributed to this sham of a justice. Yet this denial is completely at odds with the supposed official governmental objective of obtaining peace and reconciliation between all ethnic and religious groups. The obstacles in the way of the restitution of illegally seized property and the lack of compensation for the serious damage suffered by Serbs are all part of this institutional rejection of their legal and human rights. The fourth and final measure that I am going to evoke today that needs addressing is to put an end to the underhanded and cowardly continuation of the war by means of other than military. Civil violence against Serbs is still active today in Sarajevo, and no real measures are being put into place to stop it. Since the Dayton Accords, desecrations of Orthodox churches and cemeteries in Sarajevo have become the rule and have often coincided with Orthodox holidays. Churches, for instance, are regularly vandalized and tombs continue to be destroyed or splashed with paint in Serbian graveyards. Serbs, even dead, are still considered undesirable in Sarajevo, not even being able to rest in peace in a city that claims to be tolerant and multi-ethnic. No effort still have even been made by the authority to identify and trace the perpetrators of this desecration. Not a single monument in memory of the Serbian victims of Dobrovoljačka Street, Pofalici, or Kazani has been erected either, reinforcing the demonization of a whole people. When in the few instances that plaques have been erected, such as in the Great Park of Sarajevo or elsewhere, they have been systematically destroyed. One very important point, many pro-Bosniak organizations continue to use memorial ceremonies such as the Day of the Truth, Memorial Day, of Remembrance Day, not to honor the dead, but to foster hatred between communities. Several so-called scientific research institutes' objectives are purely political, some of them presenting themselves as scientific research centers are in reality organizations which use lobbying strategies and launch hateful petitions. Can the international community just sit back and let these despicable acts continue? Bosnian authorities have to be held to account for their actions and to be very clear in their condemnation of these unlawful behaviors. To conclude my presentation, I would like to reiterate that the issues I have evoked are not entirely regional, with no impact to the international community. The global terrorist threat is still present today in the Balkans, with many Islamic terrorist cells active. Today acts as a stark reminder of the link between the Balkans conflict and the international terrorism. I was also a witness for the defense team of two former Serbian presidents before the ICTY, and I produced an important document from Bosniak intelligence showing that Mohamed Atta, who played a key role in the 9/11 terrorist attack, was present in Bosnia in 1997 in the village of Bakotic. The 1990s war had become a breeding ground for Islamic terrorists, and many are still active today. As an international community, we cannot continue to sit back and let ethnic and religious conflicts and potential terrorist threats continue under the radar. Recent history teaches us only too well the devastating consequences of this inertia. thanks so much for listening to my presentation. I do appreciate your attention.
I do have a question here for you. In your report, you talk about the false flag operations. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Excuse me, I didn't your question.
In your report, you talk about the false flag operations. Can you tell us more about that?
In my presentation and in the report, the report I have just told now, not in the report of the Commission.
Okay, okay, then we will skip that. Any other questions, please?
This is Mark Zatezlo. I have a question that first of all, I'd like to thank all the presenters for their comprehensiveness. It was very well laid out, much of which I knew, some of which I did not. My problem is a very simple one, and this is something that is going to be ongoing from here on. Watching what's going on in America, where the media comes up with a narrative, and the facts that come in following the narrative formation don't seem to mean anything. In other words, it is once the media has decided upon their story, they don't change regardless of the facts that confront them. I think that's probably applicable here, and it's going to be very difficult to deal with. And I don't know if anybody has any reaction to that. That doesn't mean you don't try and strive and try to set the record straight and move forward, but it's a very difficult thing just watching what goes on in the United States of America, which should never happen. And any comments are appreciated.
Who is the question for? I'm sorry.
The question is for any of the presenters, if they see the same thing and what can be done about it.
Would anybody like to answer?
If I just can answer a small answer, I think the important point is to organize some conferences like this one with Tesla Foundation to try to combat fake news and to establish the historical truth. I know it's very, very difficult, but I think we have to organize this kind of conference frequently.
This is Alex Machaski. My suggestion, following up on Mark's question, would be that once this commission's report is published, it ought to be disseminated to the Serbian caucus in Congress. It certainly ought to be disseminated to the major think tanks and also to the chief of the Associated Press, and for what little good it will do to send to the Washington Times and Washington Post and the New York Times would be smart. But I think this kind of information has to be disseminated in a wide base because, as I've said many times, when I was a youngster, my Baba would always say, "Chuti, chuti, chuti." And we know from our experience during the 90s, Kasmomi Chutili, everybody hired public relations firms, and what happened to us is unforgivable. But I think this kind of important information from the Commission has to get wide dissemination. So I hope that is outcome of this effort today?
Excuse me. I would like to introduce one more member of the commission, and then we'll answer all of these questions if you allow me to do that. Member of the commission, Laurence French, Bachelor of Arts, MA and PhD in Sociology from the University of New Hampshire, PhD in Cultural Psychology from the University of Nebraska, and MA in School of Psychology from Western New Mexico University. Pursued postdoctoral studies in minorities and criminal justice education at the State University of New York, Albany. Professor Emeritus of Psychology from Western New Mexico University. Life member and fellow of the American Psychology Association and the American Society of Criminology. Served honorably with the U.S. Marine Corps and a life member of the Veterans of Foreign Wars and Disabled American Veterans. He's a licensed clinical psychologist in Arizona, a Fulbright scholar, University of Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Completed a Fulbright specialist project on war crimes and missing persons for Republika Srpska, Minister of Interior, Bosnia and Herzegovina at the University of Banja Luka. In 2018, he won a Marquis Who's Who Lifetime Achievement Award. He has over 300 publications, including 20 books. His major areas of research interests are international and comparative social, human, and criminal justice, Native American minority issues, police and criminal psychology, and neuroclinical and forensic psychology.
Okay, thank you. First, I want to say, can you hear me? Everybody hear me?
Yes.
I want to say that I feel extremely privileged to serve with such an esteemed panel of commissioners. I learned an awful lot, and they're directing me to new areas of will take years and years to continue that reading list that they've given us. My topic was follows pretty much follows Patrick's, in a sense that the title of my presentation was The Psychology of Intergroup Hostilities. And then I used the Balkan Wars as an example. And then I look at what Patrick was talking about, built on his 4 issues, is a map for restorative social justice. So I think that to look at this, I mean, we could argue forever from one group to the other until we get use a sort of, have an understanding of human behavior, common understanding of human behavior and intergroup relations that applies. The thing about this was that applied to European countries. In the past, this has been used for what we would call quote unquote third world countries, or South Africa, or looking at abuses of indigenous peoples in Australia or in Canada, etc. So what I outlined is the fact that it is important to realize that the principles of human and group psychology apply equally to all groups during times of chaos and conflict. And as this one of the questions is what do we do? We have the situation right now in the United States, or throughout the world, actually, when you have a threat to people's existence, an existential threat, in a sense that it challenges the boundaries that we rely on for the understanding of the categories that we really do not understand, like life and death. And so this virus threat, what that does is once it challenges those domains, the status quo, then rationality is usually the first casualty. People aren't thinking rationally, and yet the courts are based on a rational process. The ICTY is assuming that everybody was acting rationally. In a civil war, you're not acting rationally. No civil war do people act rationally. You may have people that have certain agendas, but the thing is that as far as the populace is concerned, you're going to have this pervasive enemy, normlessness that it has to deal with, which goes to the issues that Patrick and I are talking about. is that people, once the war ends, you don't return back to the status quo and a safe normalcy. What you have is usually a pervasive sense of different degrees of post-traumatic stress trauma. So this trauma, and as Patrick alluded to, is not only applies to directly to those involved in the from 91 to 99, if you want to talk about the extent of the war, is the NATO bombings in Serbia and the subsequent division between that and Kosovo, is that you have they have children and their children's children. So we now realize that there is a intergenerational transmission of trauma, post-traumatic stress. Those are the issues that need to be addressed. But to get to that, the thing is that you're not going to have reconciliation until somebody, and everybody alluded to this, you challenge that legal dictate. People think because it came from a court that answers it, that came down from heaven, but that's not the case. You have what you usually have to do is reassess the process, and the process was flawed from the beginning because it's an adversarial process. And you do not get to restorative or social justice using the adversarial system where you artificially create winners and losers, aggressors and victims. So, and as Victor said, that this is a civil war. I mean, there's a consensus, and it's not just a two-party civil war. You have to look at when we're talking about victims, we're talking about, Serb Orthodox, Croat Catholics, Bosnian Muslims, Jews, and Roma. And if you look into the material that go through the courts and everything, those were the basic five populations that suffered. And so we have to recognize that first of all, and the fact that mental illness doesn't have pluses and minuses. Like you can't say that while this group suffers less depression for the same act than another group. I mean, this was a basic flaw of a lot of the research, the ethical medical research that occurred in the United States, when they thought it was all right to apply more torturous techniques to Blacks and American Indians because they believed they were inferior human beings and they didn't have the same sensitivity to pain. So what we have to look at here, I think everybody's saying, is that you have to look with this greatest sensitivity to all the victims, regardless of their sectarian ethnic orientation. But the same thing is, if the people keep on having this narrative, this narrative that is now rooted in law, legal actions, that has to be challenged. So for restorative justice, you have to look at social justice comes from the idea that you look at what are the rules that are laid out in the court. That is the procedural justice. Okay, we're going to have these laws. We're going to say these events are equal atrocities, war atrocities, like Victor was talking about for the definition of a siege. So then you're going to say, how does that apply across the board? And this is where the adversary system failed, because social justice is looking at the procedural justice and then the distributive justice. And if you give Tubman's group a pass, I mean, a lot of people think that in Mostar, the bridge was bombed by the Serbs. I mean, no, there's this amnesia about the fact that this was a three-way civil war, that Tubman and the Croats were just as eager to get what they consider Herzegovina into their camp as we can anything that was attributed to the Serbs and the Muslims. This has all been played out. So this is a tripartite civil war. It's a very complex. How do you get to that? Well, you're going to have some type of truth commission. And the Truth Commission, like they had in Canada, there's a lot of resistance to truth commissions, and it's being resisted now with these reports. In Canada alone, I mean, the government and all the churches that were complicit in this cultural genocide and physical genocide of First Nation indigenous children that were incarcerated, and now they're finding all their graves, that was met with extreme resistance, which a lot of people don't know about. But finally they prevailed. And they prevailed because they had to petition the UN and other groups to do this. So the fact is that what I think you need for this Balkan War from 91 to 99 and beyond 2002, because it's still being carried out in what they call North Macedonia and Kosovo, etc., is you need a truth commission where you have to look at what are the facts that is going to be unsettling to the victims. Like Patrick said, find their bodies, find what's going on, what happened to them. So that's what you do. You bring that up to the surface for all groups. You bring up, that's what a truth commission is. It isn't pleasant, but you apply it across the board. You don't say that, use a very highly charged term like genocide and say, oh, we're only using that against an individual. That's bullshit. Everybody knows that the whole group is stigmatized when you say genocide. I mean, we don't make that in our minds, say, oh yes, only what's his name again? Oh, he's genocide, not the Serbian people. See, this is the thing about the fact that the human nature is that we pick up on these things. And so that's the most devastating, demonic label that you can use to stereotype somebody from a situation. And then as the appeals went through with the ICTY or the International Criminal Court, then they added on new things. Oh, it's physical genocide, killing all these people to eliminate the people, and then it's ethnic cleansing. Well, everybody knows if you're going to use ethnic cleansing as genocide, there's an awful lot of guilt for all three participants in that war, and including the Kosovo Serbian situation. So you take each of these procedures that you're looking at, the items, the indictment items, and then you apply them. You have a neutral committee, if you can, like I think we would pretty much fit into that category somewhat, to examine who was implicated. And you don't give somebody a pass and then you say, oh yeah, there was some atrocity, but it wasn't as much as this other group. It is the item, the indictment, that's what counts. Then you don't have a pure innocent victim class, which isn't good psychologically for them either. And then you don't have another group that's totally stigmatized as being the aggressors. Now so I think that's what you need. You're gonna have, somebody's gonna initiate one of these truth commissions so that you can get to restorative justice. And the thing is that this is for all the victims. Like I said in my last report, I said, the victims and the survivors need to form groups where they suffer from a common problem, and so that they can all be equally validated for their suffering. Everybody has to be equally validated. That's how you get onto mental health. And then women in particular would benefit from a gender-specific integrative therapeutic group structure, because people can say that in the United States white supremacy is predominant. Well, you don't have to. You have to be pretty blind not to think that male chauvinism doesn't predominate within the Slavic world or most of Europe as well. So you gotta look at the proportionality of a victim. Now, another thing that I did is when I was doing my as a Fulbright scholar from 2009 and 2010, is that I worked with all groups to look up a clinical assessments. Europe, like, and I think Patrick would agree with this, a lot of European clinicians are still in the, they use a sort of, I would say, Freudian, Jungian type of psychotherapy. But in the United States, what emerged out of the Chicago school in the 1920s and on was a new school called social psychology, which was empirically based, evidence-based. And so they developed instruments that had to go through a rigorous thing of validity, reliability and validity. And so I took those instruments. The most common one, which I think Patrick would agree with, is the mental status exam. Mental status exam is what a psychiatrist, a very, very documented event. So the MSC, mental status exam, we did that. We did it in the Slavic language. We created a Slavic language mental status exam. And then we had to test it. Bosniaks, Croats, Orthodox. And we went to different schools and stuff. And we did the Wechsler scales. Those are very good for any neuropsychological thing. You don't forget, post-traumatic stress is pretty much a syndrome in which you identify by its symptoms: depression, anxiety, sleep disorders, self-medication. And so the Wechsler scales are important. I did a workshop on those. The Rorschach, which is pretty good, as well as the thematic apperception test. But then one of the things that we did, we looked all around, couldn't find one of the strongest projective techniques that was developed was the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. They had one in Serbia, but it had nothing about gender. So we took the original MMPI, we called it the Slavic Language 360 Personality Inventory, because you have over 50, 70 years of projective information on this that would apply across the board. We put it into the Slavic language, we tested it, we did a test. We took the same population and gave them the English version. 2 weeks later, we gave them the Slavic language thing. We test reliability, and it came out to be pretty good. So this is a good instrument because it is probably the most objective, projective technique that can determine some of these symptoms that lead to PTSD. We also created the partner relationship, Slavic language, partner relationship inventory. This is where both parties take it independently of each other, and then you superimpose the graphs to see where the problems are. It used to be in the United States, it's called a marriage inventory, but we figured partner would be better term. We did that. And the one for kids, teens, is the POSIT, the problem-oriented screening instrument for teens, for kids 12 to 19. This is a very strong instrument, and it was then been translated to the Slavic language, and it's been implemented. It's been tested in Pančevo in Serbia. It's been tested within the RS. It's been tested with the Croats. We had the most difficult thing we had is getting the permission of the Catholic bishop to do it, because I had one item that dealt with teen sex, and finally got him to do it. We did the entire Muslim college, which is the high school, the Iranian college in Sarajevo. So we did these Norman tests to find out if this worked. So these instruments are there. And I think we have to use some of that to find out the extent of the secondary, post-secondary trauma events, and then address those. So I think one of the things is that we have some solutions, that they just have to get some people interested in promoting it. But if we stick to just the rhetorical thing and saying, well, nobody's going to listen, the narratives are going to compete. Competing narratives means that these arguments are going to go on and on and on and on. And you're not going to have any definitive action. So I think that with these particulars for dealing with individuals clinically, but I still think that we should, to address Patrick's third and fourth items, if we're going to stop this institutional, this disguise about, oh, we're concerned about victims. That's how we're going to mount this thing in July every year, forever, to continue to make sure people don't forget to stigmatize the Serbs for Srebrenica. So the thing that you're going to do is that these types of truth commissions, as difficult as that is for some people and some governments to do, is that may be what you have to do to lay it out. Finally lay it out. That's how it's imperfect as it was for South Africa. It did get them over that hurdle. As imperfect as it is in Canada, which is still dealing with this, it's still starting to heal and process. And I think my recommendation is you do it here. Oh, my time's up.
Thank you so very much. If you have a couple more minutes, if you have anything else to say, you can continue, or we can continue with the questions.
I talk fast to catch up for the next couple of minutes.
Okay. We do have a question from Professor Vyacheslav Simic, who just left. He has classes, so he had to leave us, unfortunately. This is a question for Professor Israeli, and he says, Professor is with us. With great respect and gratitude to Professor Israeli, is our only option for now to record the facts for some future generations, which will not be as politically correct and ideological as you know it? Telling the truth and presenting facts today, more often than not, earns you only condemnation, not only by war criminals and genocide perpetrators, but also by those who supposedly defend the truth and fight against evil.
Well, unfortunately, these days, people, rather than speaking on history and historical truth, speak about narratives. That means that unlike old times, when historians were supposed to check every detail of every fact and documents in order to write about the truth, one truth, a truth. Now, every nation, every splinter of a nation, every group has its own truth. And in the world where we are living today, of relative truth, a world of corrective or correct policies or correct thinking, that you have to be open to listen to all the other nonsense, and even if it's not true. Like when I spoke about my presentation, I spoke about famous European journals who were always cherished for their truth. We found out that they manufactured, staged accidents in order to blame the Serbs. And I know that from my own experience here in the Middle East, where I investigated and wrote a book about a series of acts staged by the Palestinians, and they accused Israel. And when an international commission of inquiry found out that the Palestinians were wrong, no journal published an apology for the lies they published. This is unfortunately the world where we live. However, when I was asked, together with my fellow members of the commission, who are all of them very righteous people to my mind, as I knew them, then we decided not to try to judge between the parties, because everyone has his own narrative, but to try as outsider, objective investigators to provide or to crystallize from all those thousands of documents we have a story which we are convinced is true, not a narrative, not a narrative on behalf of anybody, but a true story that comes out of objective investigation and analysis. And I trust that this is what we submitted in our final report.
Thank you very much. And I really apologize to Mr. Macheski for interrupting his question. I would really appreciate if you would repeat a part of your question and direct it to a person who you were asking, who you wanted to ask.
It really wasn't a question. It was a follow-up to what Mark was saying. And what I was suggesting, that this fine work by the commission, once it is printed, should be widely disseminated. It should certainly be sent to the Serbian caucus in Washington, as well as any congressional leaders and anyone listening to this that they are constituents of. It should certainly be sent to the major think tanks around the country and to the heads of the Associated Press, Washington Post, and New York Times. I think it's great to have this kind of commission work, but if this gets printed and sits on a shelf, it defeats the purpose. This information has to be widely disseminated. Put it into Srbobran, get it out to the church parishes, get it out to Serbian leaders across the country. It needs to get an awful lot of attention. Otherwise, it's a good effort, but wasted effort.
Thank you so much. And we will be in touch with you to collect the thoughts and gather some information that you might know that we don't, and we can work on this together. Thank you.
Okay.
Any other comments, please? Mr. Stephen Mayer.
This question is essentially for Larry French, although anyone can jump in, and I would actually love to have my good friend Tim Less involved in this. I'm sorry, Tim, if I dragged you into this as a surprise, but I think you have some things to offer. Larry, first of all, the question of rationality, are you suggesting that there is an objective definition to rationality that we can adhere to and know when it is being violated? The other part of it is, I think part of the difficulty with a neutral committee in this part of the world is the depth of the ethnic issue. I am suspicious that a neutral committee can be established. All through the 1990s, we at the CIA tried to impress the Clinton administration with the depth of the ethnic issue. And in the American context, that was never really understood. And I would suggest it was not understood in Northwestern Europe either. How do you construct a neutral committee with this depth of ethnic, not only hostility, but consciousness? I noticed that the instruments that you talked about were conducted, I think, in every example you mentioned, in ethnic isolation. It was not conducted at one time across ethnicity. The other thing I wanted to know was, what kind of blowback have you experienced for your work, and how have you handled it? And finally, for Dr. Israeli, I think if you were looking for more even-handed truthfulness, I modestly recommend that you did not dig into CIA sources nearly enough. So let me leave it at that.
All right, I think I can answer. Can I answer what I understand your question to be? First of all, I'm using the term, I mean, Patrick can correct me if I'm wrong, but in our training, in clinical training, we're looking for, and I'm using the term rational within the clinical perspective. When we're interviewing somebody, we want to know if their thoughts, quote unquote, are rational or irrational, to make a distinction between a psychosis, like a very difficult one to determine is delusional disorder. And so they seem rational most of the time, but then there's this little thing that isn't rational. So I'm looking at rational means that the person can take care of themselves, you know, how we differentiate between somebody that may have a psychosis, which is an irrational behavior. And so that's what we're looking at. In other words, we all have norms, and norms change, but we adapt to those norms. That's the status quo. So that's rational behavior. So that's your life, your everyday life when things are going well. When you have a crisis, including something like the COVID-19, then people who used to get along with you thought were rational, and they thought you were rational, then this irrationality emerges. So it's a clinical term. As far as the tests, predictive tests, when you're looking at validity, you know, validity and the thing is that you have to take a norm. You have to norm the test for that group. And that's what we did. And the POSIT, which was developed by National Institute of Mental Health, did all that money in there for that. They've used it in different languages and we've different norms. I've used it I've normed it for Navajos. I've normed it for rural blacks in America. I knew that for Mexicans, and other people have done it for other groups. So your norm is the closest thing you can get to looking for the fact that the instrument is valid and it's reliable. Reliability and validity. There's a whole bunch of courses. I mean, it's a headache to get to your doctoral studies with that. And then the thing about the panel, if you looked at social justice says, what are the laws? Because that's what we're dealing with, the laws, procedural law. Then let's apply those to all the parties and see what surfaces. This was not done, in my estimation, and I think anybody else that looked at the ICTY, this was not done. It was not done equitably. It was disproportionately administered to Serbs, while other people got a pass. So that's what you're looking at to get to restorative justice. You have to have social justice. That this is the rules we're dealing with. And now we're going to make sure that distributed apply to all parties and not just a few to stigmatize. And I think I answered your three issues you addressed to me.
Thanks, Larry.
Any other comments, please? Mr. Less?
Yes, I have a question for the panelists. It's been a very fascinating discussion, which I followed with tremendous interest. But I wondered, what is the outcome of this that you would like to see? I mean, if you succeeded in persuading politicians and publics of the veracity of your report, what is the political consequence that you would like to see follow from that? Can I perhaps start with Raphael as the chair?
Yes, I am responding. Thank you for the question. It's very well taken. As I tried to say, due to the contradiction between narratives, and from the beginning I said that the commission is not out to judge or to deliver a judgment or to convince anybody. So I consider our report of 1,400 pages, which was also published academically as a study, as an academic study, I consider it as a writing of history, as part of historiography. the historian, when he writes a history book, does not want to convince anybody. He simply took an issue, investigated it to the best he or she can, and he puts it to the public for judgment or for reading. And therefore, I considered our report in that light. So I cannot say that I don't care if I convinced or not. But unlike the government of Republika Srpska, who commissioned us to write the report, they are interested to convince somebody. We, the members of the commission, or I personally at least, never had the intention to convince anybody. To put it very, very strongly, if you like, I simply couldn't care less. I don't want to convince anybody. I did my honest work of research. I am convinced that I was completely objective because I have no interest in other party. I am not involved. It's not my war. And therefore, I am satisfied that my findings are right there like a piece of history. You want to believe it, take it. You don't want, leave it. That's all there is to it.
A question by any of our other guests? I would like to mention the last member of this commission, Mr. Giuseppe Zacharia, who from 2019 to 2020 has served as a member of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry of Suffering of the Serbs between 1991 and 1995. He unfortunately passed away in April 2020 at the age of 69, and we really thank him for his dedication and his service to our cause. If we don't have any more questions, I would like to thank you all, to all of the researchers, our commission, on behalf of us Serbs around the world. We know that we deserve the truth, the justice for us, our future, and for all of the victims of Sarajevo and other places around ex-Yugoslavia. We demand that the world hears our side of the story. With this, I would like to conclude this conference. Thank you again very much.